Hey there, Mike Dunn with Gamingtrend at PAX Unplugged. We're here with Jason Matthews to get an actual hands-on look at First Monday in October. This is a game that is on Kickstarter right now, and will be through
uh, right up until Christmas,
right
basically.
up until Christmas. We also have an interview with Jason and Talia, the designer of the game. Um, that is going to be an upcoming podcast episode if it hasn't already been published by now. Um, because I like to switch things up sometimes. Um, but I was really excited about the game, and I really wanted to get a good look at it. And we also have John Farrell, who we usually talk about RPGs with, but turns out John's day job is that he's a lawyer and he has a very keen interest in the subject of the Supreme Court. For some reason, I don't know why. Um, but I thought this would be a good time to get an actual look, nitty gritty look at this awesome game.
Thank you so much. Well, this is the first Monday in October, and it is a history of the Supreme Court, essentially its entire history, although there's a cutoff date because the Supreme Court continues to make interesting decisions, and eventually we had to be like, well, okay, we don't want to continually revise the deck.
Well, and also, like, I imagine balancing the game with that point would probably be a little harder.
Indeed, indeed. And what you're looking at now is a game that is pre-set up. We have the initial set of justices on the bench. All the justices are divided into basically three eras, and there are also three eras for the court cases. And so you should have roughly historical judges sitting on the bench at the same time that the cases that they actually heard during history. And these are the cases in question. And right now you can see each of the cases has an indicator as to which way the Supreme Court would decide that case right this second. And how do we figure out what that is? Well, all of these justices have a rating for how they feel about certain very important parts of the issues of constitutional interpretation that the Supreme Court has returned to again and again. And those four issues are reflected over here on this chart. The first is obviously the money sign, that's the Commerce Clause, and the question of should the federal government or the states regulate commerce. Similarly, the eagle here represents national security and what deference are we going to give the federal government on questions of national security in the military. The megaphone is free speech. And last is equality, which represents kind of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment cases, but also questions around women's suffrage and the rest of it. In this board is set up so that the silver icons represent the federalist position, a stronger U.S. central government, and the gold symbols are for the state government or deference to the states. So each one of these justices has a political and judicial philosophy that they're bringing to the bench when they're appointed. And the entirety of this bench is reflected over here on where these markers are sitting at the moment. The one important distinction, though, is that the Chief Justice is worth twice as much. So William Patterson, who is the signer of the Declaration of Independence and the constitutional member at the Constitutional Convention, he's really big on central control of commerce. And so commerce is way up here, leaning towards the federal government at this time. And he's kind of a fan of free speech as is understood in the First Amendment. But other justices feel different ways, and so the composition of the court is reflected here. You will notice that these justices, certain justices have a black cube on them at the start. This represents the aging of those justices, and it assists.
Dark specter of no.
Yeah, the dark specter of mortality.
Yes.
And why that matters is as justices come and go on the court, when they come onto the court, you adjust the philosophy of the court by whatever these indicators are, but there's also an impact when they leave the court. It's a somewhat diminished impact, but still, as people come off, it's going to move the court in the opposite direction of whatever their central tenets of their philosophy were at the time. So the more these dark cubes are on a justice, the more likely they are to leave their mortal coil and join the giant bench in the heavens.
There you go. Love it.
So how do we accomplish all this? The central mechanism of the game is a choice of actions that are available to the players over here. During each round of the game, you are going to make exactly 3 choices, and one of those choices, it can be what is called a supreme choice, and it's basically a double-powered version of the standard action. And we begin the game with the person who has most recently been in a courtroom. That could be as a lawyer or as a defendant. Either is.
I definitely think he's got me beat. It's been a few years for me.
And they are going to take one of the actions.
Not criminal offenses, just so everybody's clear on that.
They're going to take one of the 5 or 6 actions that are available to them that are laid out here on this board. The most common one, and the one that people end up doing frequently, is to take influence. The reason that you take additional influence is that's how you buy clerks. And clerks are your real power on the board. There's a little bit of an area control vibe on a game with no map, but your foot soldiers in this area control are your clerks, and they're the lawyers that you're going to be placing both with members of the bench and, more importantly, as litigants on the Supreme Court cases as they move down they move through the docket.
So it's almost kind of like a PAX game where you're not directly impacting the board state, you're influencing it through things that are there.
That's exactly right. You really are going to need to manipulate this track, but with one exception, you can't do it directly. You're going to have to worry about the composition of the court and who is going to be coming up into the court. At the same time, you keep an eye on how are these cases resolving and where do I want to place my bets, essentially, for how they're going to resolve based on who's getting old and who's going to come off the court, who's about to join the court, and what do these cases look like. There's one final and important element to that part of strategy, which is you start the game with 3 philosophy cards. At the end of the game, you're going to score victory points based on how many cases of these types you've won. In the first era, you still have all 3 cards. In the second era, you're going to discard down 1, and by the end of the game, you will have your identity and the philosophy that you're most in favor of. So, you can kind of like hedge your bets, or you can go all in on certain kinds of cases, and that should influence your play as well.
You're going to represent the erosion of your ideals over time.
Just like real law. By the end of the game, if you believe in anything, it'll be a miracle.
Look, a billionaire giving me free vacations will not influence me at all. I don't do it right, you would say it would.
Yeah, exactly. It's silliness. Okay.
Just a side note, it is almost impossible not to be a little snarky about the Supreme Court based on the current context of today. Forgive us.
It is worth saying also that these cards have both the information about philosophy, but also just some discussion of each of the justices and the cases. So you're going to get some more context for all of this as you play through the game.
That's absolutely true. We're trying to spoon feed people history effortlessly, not smash them in the face with it. But we do think that after you play a game of this, it'll give you a little bit of an additional framework for how to evaluate headlines about new Supreme Court cases that you didn't have before you played this game.
But if you need to smash someone in the face with it, that's what this gavel is for.
Precisely. And this one is plastic, but go get yourself a good wooden one.
Right.
Um, so the first action,
player marker.
there will be a gavel for a first player marker, a little wooden one.
Okay.
So the first action is, of course, take influence. This is your capital to purchase additional clerks. The second thing is to spend influence to add a clerk to the case. So action 1 and action 2 work in tandem, and they are kind of the core actions that you're going to take in the game. Each of these cases, as I said, you can tell which way the Supreme Court would decide when, based on where this arrow is pointing, if it was deciding at the moment. But you can kind of puzzle out which way things are going to go. And as you're puzzling out, the cost of lawyers in certain positions is higher or lower depending on where the case is in the course of decision and which side is prevailing. It costs more to place a lawyer on the side that's already prevailing. It also costs more to place a lawyer on a side that already has lawyers. And it costs more to place a lawyer on a case that's further along. So back here, you can kind of guess and manipulate the court so that this will be true later. Whereas if you're trying to deal with the case that's just about to be decided, it's going to be very expensive in terms of your influence markers to place a lawyer on that case.
And it's worth thinking about the fact that this is true in actual law, because the more you do right at the Court of Common Pleas or circuit court level, the better established record you have later on, and the cheaper it is to bribe whoever it is you need to influence.
That's right. And leaving aside the more cynical point, the better your record is for when you're being reviewed for appeal. That really is a truth in the law.
Now, to interrupt for just a brief moment, is the player more of an abstraction in this game when you're not actually representing any person or like thing in history?
The notion is that you are representing a judicial philosophy. Sometimes that's very concrete, like the judicial philosophy is the state of Louisiana's judicial philosophy. That's going to tend to drive your decision making on cases about civil rights and will usually put you on the side
That's
that is
these 3 cards right here.
precisely
That's the player.
That's the player.
Got it. Okay.
That's right. The third thing that you can do is you can kind of hurry God along by placing an additional aging marker on any one of the justices. Each of the justices, most of them are a D4 that represents how long they're going to stay on the bench. But for instance, John Marshall was extremely long-lived and was on the bench for a very long time, so he's a D6. And some of these guys were barely there. They caught a cold and then died, and they're a D3. So when you place an additional aging marker on them, you roll the die. If the number you've rolled is equal to or less than the number of aging cubes on the justice, they come off the bench. And that brings us over to this, which is add one of your lawyers to any judicial candidate. This is a place where it can be a little bit collaborative because you know that I am interested in, let's say I'm interested in national security cases, but you would like to see the free speech cases go down a little bit. So maybe I'll place a lawyer there, and on a subsequent turn, you'll place a lawyer there, and that'll help guarantee that James Wayne ultimately joins the bench if James Iredell comes off the bench. At the end of each turn, after we've both taken all 3 of our actions, the lawyer with the least support comes off the court or comes off the candidate pool automatically. The fifth thing that you can do with your turn is that you can adjust any one of the judicial philosophies by 1 space. You write a law review article and that moves it, or a treatise. And the last thing,
It's funny. I actually like. I thought that's what it was.
oh,
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I was like, is that like writing an editorial?
yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. Exactly what it is.
And similarly, the rules vary by case, but you can also, even if you're not a party to a case, write a legal brief and submit it to the court for consideration.
Oh, that's right. What is that called?
That is an amicus or amicus brief. I don't know what the pronunciation is there.
Um,
Jason, what is the pronunciation?
I say amicus,
No,
but I could be wrong. I didn't go to Harvard.
I think
so
I
don't know.
could be wrong. Is what always is said after stating your opinion on that.
Precisely. Um, the last thing is kind of a little bit of a fluff action. These are a list of kind of superpowers, things that amend or break the rules, and you can rest. And the robing room is a real place in the Supreme Court. It's kind of like the Supreme Court's locker room. They, right before they come out on the bench, they all get robed and they chit chat there about cases that they're about to hear. And that's what this is representing, that kind of,
Drugs.
yeah, do drugs and take bribes, apparently. But anyway, that area. Those are all of the actions, and then on the right-hand column of your player aid, you can see that for the most extent, they're like doubled if you use your one supreme action token on one of these actions during the round. And that is essentially play. The game will end when one of two clocks comes to an end. Either we run through all the cases or we run through all the justices, but both clocks are going at the same time. And, that'll usually take about 6 or 7 turns, I guess. And the person who, has the most influence at the end of the game will be the winner.
Very nice. So what do you think, John?
How long does this usually go? Because it's interesting that you've got this push-pull of the values you're representing and the influence that becomes more obvious over time when you're trying to push things.
It's a little bit tricky in that there is a component to this game that the players are collectively affecting the clock. So we have played with playtest groups that are super fond of killing judges. I don't know why. It's just like their thing. So those games can be over in an hour. I would say more commonly it's about an hour and a half.
It's not like their healthcare insurance CEOs or anything, right?
Precisely. And there are certain and I should say that after each case is resolved, there is a case effect, kind of a societal effect that will also impact the kind of rules of the game, or might age justices because the case was particularly stressful or contentious, and that is another element of play. But it also affects the clock frequently, so that either more cases will be resolved quickly, or more judges will come off the bench quickly.
And it's also interesting that you have direct ways to influence some of these actions, but also a lot of more indirect ways, like building up influence on judges, getting them removed, or just trying to move the track up and down.
Yeah, exactly. And usually that kind of longer term planning ends up being better than just tactical, but sometimes in the moment you want it to be, you want to have that big impact. And I should say that in the very first turn, these cases would not resolve. They're all going to scoot down. We're going to add a new case. Then once a case gets over here, we're going to resolve it. We're going to award points based on who has the most. Well, let's make it you. Whoever has the most lawyers on the winning side, and that is determined by the philosophy of the court at the time. If the philosophy of the court is way to the edge, which is these darkened areas on either side, like they are hard over on free speech, or they're hard over on national security, whatever, then when you win a case in that way, you get five prestige. And if you win a case where it's somewhere closer to the center, then you're going to win 3 prestige. Whoever has the second most lawyers on the prevailing side will get 1 prestige. And then after that, you can spend the clerks that you've been so assiduously kind of pushing on to the Supreme Court. And you can write an opinion for a bonus point and use one of your clerks that's sitting on the bench. Or alternatively, if you're on the losing side, you can write a dissent, and then you collect points at the end of the game for having the most dissents. The great dissenter.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm really curious. I imagine you have tested this with probably primarily with people who are not lawyers.
That's right.
But I also would imagine that you've tested this with people who are.
That
And
is true.
I'm curious, like what has the response been from lawyers who are like their very living and their what they do with their life is integrally enmeshed in this history of law in the United States.
Well, as you know, most lawyers are not going to get an opportunity to practice even in federal court, much less before the U.S. Supreme Court. But for all of us, this is an important part of our training. So you get, there's a certain charm to the recognition that, oh, yeah, I remember these cases. Oh, yeah, I got a C in constitutional law. And so it resonates. I think the game resonates with lawyers probably more than it's going to resonate with any other kind of person, just because all of these things are more familiar to them than they are going to be the general public. Most Americans will know Dred Scott. They'll know Roe versus Wade, but a lot of other seminal cases in Supreme Court history, people are just not going to know.
Yep.
Same really with the justices, of course. Everybody knows who RGB is right now, but I would wager most people don't even know who John Marshall is, even though for lawyers he's perhaps the most important Supreme Court justice that ever lived.
Yeah, I definitely have heard of John Marshall.
I feel good.
You're
making me feel better about America.
But I don't think I've heard of any of these others. And I think that's what's appealing to me personally is like this like votes for women. And I know we talked about this on the podcast. Is sort of like a peeling away of the veil, a side of history that I was never really exposed to, and I feel like this in particular almost feels like Votes for Women felt like an important game because of that, because of the perspective that I got from playing that game on both sides. And I feel like there's a lot of potential for that, and just like anytime I can boost my knowledge to help me navigate the insanity of history today, and put it into better perspective, I think that's always like a winning scenario.
Well, and I think it is important for people to realize, and if you play this game, or even if you play it once, I think you will quickly understand that as unpleasant as those of us who are living in the present moment think that the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court is, or a lot of us think that, it has been worse.
Yeah.
It has been worse.
Read the Dred Scott decision if you don't believe that.
Yeah, precisely. And that is an important perspective to have. You know, we have made it through other tough times in history, and jurisprudence in general has progressed in the right way as long as you look at a long enough arc. But any particular moment, my gosh, some of these cases are atrocious.
And this is also a good teaching tool, both for some of the dry things, like you should know what McCullough v. Maryland is, but also for the general understanding that there are a lot of ways that the Supreme Court gets influenced, and some of it is at that much earlier level. Who gets made a circuit court justice who is then eligible for Supreme Court? What happens at the trial court level that then gets into the record of the Supreme Court decision? You know, all of these things that common people think you have no influence over the Supreme Court, but you have influence over all of the steps that lead to that station happening.
Yeah, once that decision is handed down, like that's like the most visible, most noisy, I guess is a good way to put it. Aspect of the whole thing, but there's a whole lot that comes before that.
Yeah, precisely. And you know, I again, I don't want to be too cynical about the knowledge level of the American public, but I also think that a lot of people are not particularly aware of the ways in which the Supreme Court has been adjusting how we view constitutional freedoms.
Right.
It has not been a static thing in any way, shape, or form, and not just on things about like Roe versus Wade, but on the whole panoply of the Constitution. And this game will give people an additional perspective on that. And so then when you see another headline, which you inevitably will, it'll resonate in a way that it didn't before, because you'll have a little bit of some framework, some guidelines for, okay, what does this actually mean?
And as far as people who are interested, we've talked a little bit about the Kickstarter. Is there anything specific they should look out for in terms of your website or socials to follow this and learn some more information?
Well, of course, fortcircle.com is the website for the company, and we're providing updates there. We'd love to have people sign up because we want to make sure that these games have the widest possible access. And this is not exactly the tip of the iceberg of a long line of games with this same kind of educational mission, but it is one of a series that we're working on, and I think everything else we're doing is also exciting, and so we really want to help create a fan base for games that are about history, but they're not about the Battle of Gettysburg.
Right.
They're not about Stalingrad for the 50th time. Exploring elements of our history and world history that are under represented in gaming and under simulated.
And these subjects may seem and appear dry, except that they drive major decisions in policy and lawmaking in the practice of our everyday lives, and they are worth learning.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely, and I think that's it. And it's like I said, I feel like Votes for Women is an important game, especially for today. I feel like this is also an important game, especially for today, because there's a lot of confusing things and ideas around the Supreme Court right now that, looking back and casting back on the history of the Supreme Court, might help us understand. And this is a much better way to do it than through reading a bunch of like case files and court decisions.
People aren't going to do that,
Right.
And it's not fair for us to expect people to all go to law school in order to have an educated opinion about what the Supreme Court is doing.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not saying that's a societal problem.
Yes.
There is a lot of solutions necessary to it, but in our own little way, this is one of the things that we think can help.
Well, it's like I tell my kids, be the change you want to see in the world.
Right.
This, I feel like, is living to that ideal. Like, people need to know about this. Let's figure out better ways to educate them.
Right.
Ways that are entertaining. And also another thing I like about a lot of the historical board games that have been coming out in recent years is how uncomfortable they make you feel. You know, like they put you in roles that maybe don't really kind of align with your own values, but that's a winning condition, and you're trying to win this game. So it might give you some insight into what people thought back in the day when it really happened for real.
I mean, this game is going to have that problem highlighted in a number of occasions, because ultimately I'm going to look at my philosophy and I'm going to look at Dred Scott and I'm going to be like, well, I know how I feel about this, but, you know, the Attorney General of Georgia feels a different way, and so I'm placing my bet here.
Yep.
And I think it's good for people to experience a little bit of friction, the same kind of societal friction that the historical actors do, and to understand that you feel one way, your feeling does not necessarily reflect the society we're in.
Well, this looks great, Jason. I'm really glad we got a chance to look at it in person. I'm going to be looking forward to getting my own copy.
Fantastic.
When now the Kickstarter's happening right now.
Yeah.
When are you hoping to?
It will definitely be delivered before. It'll definitely be delivered before Christmas. If we can pull it off, we'll have it ready for the first Monday in October.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah, that's like the secret goal. Yes,
Dream. Yes.
but unfortunately, the incoming president of the United States is busy rattling sabers with the Chinese, and we'll just see how shipping goes for the next year.
Yep. Yep. Well, definitely hit up the Kickstarter, back this thing. It looks great. We'll put the link in the description, and we will continue to cover First Monday in October until it's on tables next year.
Thank you so much for taking the time, guys. It was a pleasure.
All right.
Jazz hands.